We should be good to go.
Okay, cool. Thank you all for having me. And I was gonna say a little bit about my connection to the place space, but it will come up in the presentation. So I'm gonna start you all with a story, and I guess I'll say it's a data story, because it includes quantitative information and numerical information. I'm hoping you'll catch some of it, but I'll explain as we move forward. My story is going to talk about Langston Hughes and it's going to talk about Langston Hughes and his most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So let me see if I can move forward. So in 1920, Langston Hughes graduated from high school, and there's this really cool recording of him talking about that moment in 1920 when he graduated from high school, and he said something along the lines of, I was fresh out of high school and I was 18 years old. After graduating from high school, he graduated in Cleveland, Ohio, and then he made a trip from Cleveland to Mexico. His mother lived in Cleveland. His father was living in Mexico, and so he was going to visit his father. And that was going to be the trip. He went by train. Along the way, as he was going, he goes from Southern Illinois to St. Louis. And if you know anything about that kind of geography, which connects to you all, to get from Southern Illinois to St. Louis, you have to cross the Mississippi River. I was so hyped coming in today because I was crossing over the bridge. And I know you all probably do that bridge all the time. I've been at my school for 20 years. I live in St. Louis. I teach in Southern Illinois. So I cross the Mississippi River all the time. And I almost take it for granted that I do that. Hughes was really inspired though, when he was going across that river, and he started thinking of some ideas, and he took out a piece of paper, took a pen or probably a pencil in 1920, and he started writing, and he wrote out this poem, which became The Negro Speaks of Rivers as he crossed over that. The reason that is important because there's perhaps no poem that has circulated more in anthologies than The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And of course, I would forget something, but I actually brought copies for you all, so just in case. So you will have it, so. There you go, there you go. And I know Kathy Lou, you probably know this by memory, so I won't have you read it out loud. But anyway, so that's 1920, if you all are keeping up with me giving numbers. At the beginning of 1921, Hughes submitted this poem that you're holding, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Oh, sorry, let me move. I forgot that I had a thing here. Of course, it's not working for me. Do I point it here or do I point it?
It will point at the screen.
Okay.
Is it turned on?
Uh,
You should be pushing. No, it's not on. So on the side there, on this side, yeah. It turns off. Yeah, there you
I can go old school and do stuff.
go. Yeah, I think it may have.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's not even anything. Oh. Okay, so real quick, sorry, and so I said 1920. And
No.
okay, now it is. Of course it is. Well, I love technology presentations. Anyway, you should have seen me thinking through all of the things that were happening. Anyway, on the far end, I don't have Hughes in 1920, but on the far end, this is like circa 1914. And then this is Hughes, and he's in Kansas. This is Hughes in 1925, and he's in Washington, D.C. And I wanted you all to see him in 1920. I can't find a photo. So I said, wow, this is the happy medium. So in the middle, though, you have the Eads Bridge, which is crosses the Mississippi. And it's there today. It looks different now. They really updated it. But this is an older school photo. You know, that's how one of the bridges you can take to get from Southern Illinois to St. Louis. And really what you would say if you were over there, you would say from East St. Louis, which is in Illinois, to St. Louis. And there are several bridges. I don't take this one most times. I mostly take the Poplar Street Bridge. But there's also another bridge just right on the other side of this one called the MLK Bridge. And then there's a bridge right down from that one called the Stand. And there's a bridge, McKinley Bridge, a little bit down from there. Anyway, this is what one of, I don't think it was this bridge, but this was one of the bridges, or at least the route Hughes would have taken to cross there. I haven't forgotten to just about technology, y'all. We'll just let you know, I'll keep it in your mind. We get in there. Anyway, 1921, the beginning of 1921, actually, January, Hughes submits this poem called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He submits it in January 21, and then 6 to the Crisis magazine, which is the most famous magazine, African-American magazine in the country at the time. And I'm laughing, I'm gonna keep teasing you, Kathy, Louis, but I gotta say this. He submitted it in January 1921, and they published it in June. Like, that's just like that just cannot happen now. Can you imagine submitting something and then seeing it within 5 years? But he saw it in 6 months, so it was there. Anyway, so it went to the Crisis magazine, which is published by the NAACP. And it's a fairly short poem, if you can see. It's only 103 words, 62 unique words. And I'm gonna say 12 lines. I know what you're looking at is more than 12 lines, it's 18. But when Hughes publishes how he wants to, it's only 12 lines, but they broke it up. This is from page 71, and they had so much other stuff on the page, so it just takes up a little bit at the time. I won't get deep into literary analysis, but I'll just say this to keep us on our data track. It mentions 4 different rivers in that poem. Those rivers are on 3 different continents, and they move through 15 different countries. In 1925, Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, was reprinted in a literature anthology called The New Negro. And that anthology becomes one of the most well-known publications of the era. Of course, now when we say the New Negro, we think of the Harlem Renaissance, or some people like to call it the New Negro movement. And here's where my interest in kind of data collection really picks up, in data storytelling, because 1925, The Negro Speaks of Rivers is reprinted. A couple of years later, still in the 1920s, a couple of other editors of anthologies, so Elaine Locke published The New Negro, he selects it. A couple of other anthologists select that same poem and put it in an anthology in the 20s. In the 30s, a few anthologists, editors, put it in their literature anthologies. In the 1940s, a few do it. You all get the point. From 1925 all the way to 2022, every single decade, at least 2 or 3, sometimes 5 and 6, and then at least one decade, like 10 editors publish the Negro Speaks of Rivers. And so I just gave you a sampling of anthologies, the new Understanding the New Black Poetry, the Northern Anthology of African American Literature, and then African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song. All of them, of course, published the Negro Speaks of Rivers, but there were so many more. In fact, I started collecting them, and I identified 78 different anthologies published between 1925 and 2022 that include Hughes' poem. And for now, I'm only talking about anthologies published in the United States. So if we go outside of the US, Melanie, we would see it in all different kinds of anthologies. In French-speaking countries, we see it in Spanish-speaking countries, all over. And I also then include just some of the various editions, which is just to say, it's far more than 78. But I was doing a thing with bibliography. I said, I'm only gonna list the ones I actually physically see. And so it's 78, which is more than any other one I've been able to put my eyes on. And I didn't count 2023 yet. So I'm sure if there's an anthology with African-American literature in there, this poem is gonna show up on that list. I want to interrupt though for just a second, just talking about this to tell you all how I get here, how I got to this whole subject. Too often, I think it's kind of a distance between what's going on in African American literary studies and then technology. Many of the people, and not all, but many of the people who do really solid work in African American literary studies aren't really involved with digital projects or visualizations that showcase the publishing histories of writers like Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright, Toni Morrison, and more. We could say the reverse as well, that people who do technology work, people who do digital humanities, they aren't always the people who do most of what's happening with African American literary studies. So we end up with like a really big difference, I would say. And I think part of the challenge in African American literary studies is that folks get less access to critical developments with respect to technology. Though to be fair, we could say the same about a lot of different sectors of the humanities. So I focus on African American literary studies because that's what I do, but the more I look around, it's just hard for a lot of different areas to get really deep into technology. Whatever the case, a lot of folks are underexposed. We don't have enough models of what can be done, but exposure or underexposure is just part of the problem. The other major issue is really exclusion. There are so many instances and so many examples where folks in African American literary studies are simply excluded from major technology projects. And I have to tell you, like, those two issues of underexposure and exclusion, they really resonate powerfully for me. As I told some of you all, I grew up right down the street in Jackson, Tennessee. And just being in the South, you get to think a lot about underexposure and exclusion. It's just something that was really there. They were these really incredible forces, I would say, underexposure, exclusion, in the lives and all of our lives, and especially they were like that in ways we weren't even aware of. At least I wasn't aware of when I was growing up. And I would say one of the things that I thought about when I was coming here was in the 1990s, when I was in high school, the late 90s, I was in high school in Jackson, Tennessee, and that's when they desegregated the high schools. Now, you probably heard of something called Brown versus Board, and I know you think that happened in 1954, and maybe it did, but I can tell you Jackson, Tennessee did not get that memo. So they didn't start doing that until the 1990s. And that mattered in many ways to me, but one of the most powerful was when I went to high school. So they figured out an equation and they made there were 3 major high schools at the time. And they said, okay, the closest number we can get to is something like 60-40 or something. They made it even, but then you had to bus people in various places. And so I was bused to the other side of town, to the north. I was on the east side, which is the Black side of town. And I had to go to high school in the north side, which is the white side of town. And I remember the high school we went to, which was made the high school. There was a high school and a middle school, but when all of us were busted, they closed the middle school part to make it part of the high school. And we were sitting in this room, and they were still moving things around. And all I remember is us seeing these microscopes, and they were really fancy. And we talked to some classmates, and we were like, oh, wow, where were these? Were these for the high school? And they said, no, we had these in middle school. And it just blew our minds. I remember that. Because we didn't imagine that you could have microscopes that nice in middle school, but they did. So anyway, underexposure and then exclusion. And I wonder if people had that access on the Black side of town in 1968 or 1978 or 1988, like would it have changed the trajectory of people's lives? Anyway, so that's when I think about that exclusion. So keeping that in mind, I do want to transition and mention what happens when we do merge African American literary studies and technology. So I am taking y'all in the transition. I'm telling you, oh, this is really bad. But now I'm going to tell you some of what I've been able to do when we have had access. I want to show what we get when we blend data storytelling and engagements with publishing histories of Black poetry. Over the last year, I worked with a digital humanist, Meg Smith, in the DH Center at my university, and we built something that I call the African American Poetry Tracker. It's a digital resource that documents or tracks the publication records of African American poems. And for now, I track works across various literature anthologies. And I display my findings using data visualization and whiteboard animations. And the reason I began today's presentation by talking to you about Langston Hughes is because he's the poet and the poem I started with. And I knew I wanted to start with it because I knew it appeared a lot of places. I didn't realize it appeared this many places, but it was useful that I started there because now when I start building on with other poets, I can work my way backward in some ways. I'm back behind just a little bit on my slide because I was talking to you about the divide between African American literary studies and technology. And so I started, you all remember that early image I showed you all of that Eads Bridge. This is a more recent image. And the image is taken from the view of East St. Louis. There's this like observatory called the Malcolm Martin Memorial, and you can stand over and you can look into St. Louis. And it sort of represents to me though a divide. I mean, the view is very nice, but the place where you're standing, East St. Louis, is far under-resourced when it comes to the place you're looking at in St. Louis. So it always stands out to me like that. Anyway, so the poetry tracker is me trying to merge those things. And so I had this idea of saying, like, here's what happens when you pull technology into a field that you don't always get to see it. And so first I'll show you all some images, and then I'll take you to the actual site. So here's some of what I did. One of the things I did, first of all, and I know you can't see this, so you're gonna have to take my word on the colors. The very top one, those are the 78 anthologies that show the Negro Speaks of Rivers. And then coming down, the next one is the Weary Blues, Mother to Son, Dream Variations, and so forth, just showing you what it looks like with Hughes's poems and how much they're anthologized. And this is just a still, I'm gonna show you the data story in just a second, but I'm gonna show you one more before I take you out of this to point it out. Then I want to compare to other poems. So at the very top is the Negro Speaks of Rivers. Below that is If We Must Die by Claude McKay. And then We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And you all can see that it's like, even just, you can't see the title perhaps where you're from, but even the images, you see how much more the Negro Speaks of Rivers is than If We Must Die, which if you're in a literature class or you're talking to your undergraduates, you will say, oh, If We Must Die is a widely anthologized poem. The Negro Speaks of Rivers is a widely anthologized poem. I became very curious though, what's the difference between a widely anthologized poem and a widely anthologized poem? And it's a big difference. Like 78 and 48, that's a big difference in terms of anthology. And let's think about another poem, For My People, which is at the very bottom of my list here, but it's everybody knows For My People by Margaret Walker. But it's 26 anthologies of all of those that I looked at. So it lets you know that it's still considered, you say that too, For My People, We Real Cool, widely anthologized poems. But they look very different than what a Hughes widely anthologized poem is. And so that's the kind of thing I was looking at. Now, if it works for me, I'm gonna show you what this looks like in a visualization. So these are the kind of technology projects we're working on. So first, this visualization I'm going to walk you all through, the 10 most anthologized Langston Hughes poems. And this is from the site I was telling you all about, the African American Poetry Tracker. So I started with collecting Hughes's 10 most anthologized poems, and we have them all together here. So I will give the site at the end. If you come to the site, if you just hover over any of these dots, it'll tell you exactly where that poem is from. But if you scroll down, and there are 362 appearances of those poems, and among his 10 most anthologized. You scroll down, it'll then go in order for you and show you that first graph I showed you all. But then we can look at it in terms of years. So you see the Negro Speaks of Rivers, here it is, the New Negro in 1925, and then in 1970, you see it, you just poke on the purple ones, or you can just hover all the way down to 2020, you see going there. And then the other story, you see something else I was really fascinated with. So the ones over here is all of his poems in primarily white anthologies. And then over on this side, it shows you primarily African-American anthologies. And you see the African-American anthologies are much larger. So it's interesting to know that that's why Hughes is one of the most anthologized, because he was being published quite a bit in both, but even more in African-American anthologies. One of the things I became very fascinated with, though, is if you talk to people in American literature, for instance, they will talk about the Negro Speaks of Rivers. If you talk to people in African American literature, though, they'll talk about that one, but they'll also talk about mother to son. Like that's one that really circulates in African American spaces. So I became really fascinated by that thing. So anyway, when and if you get a chance to go here, you can play around with this site. Like you can go here and just choose a poem. So like that, like I told you on mother to son, you can remove all the other ones here. And then say mother to son, and you'll see it shows up, and then you can add the Negro Speaks of Rivers, and you see you can add out to, some things like that you get to say. All right, I'm gonna take you all to another one, the other one that I was talking about. Here, I was interested in looking at 7 of the most widely anthologized poems. Again, knowing the Hughes is the most, but then looking at how they compare to each other. So I put all of those poems up here, and then here, and this one's a little bit more up to date, so you could actually hover over the Negro Speaks of Rivers. You could go to Nikki Giovanni has a poem called Nikki Rosa, and you see how that appears. And I was fascinated because, again, this is one you would say is widely anthologized. But when you look at it in comparison to the Negro Speaks of Rivers, it looks very different. And if I added on to this, though, you would see that her poem is really widely anthologized compared to many other poems. So there it is again, showing you all the comparison. And then I did it by years, going across the couple of decades. And you see, like, even when I add all the numbers up, it looks one way. But if you look during the 1970s, Amir Baraka really stands out. It's really Amir Baraka, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay. And what's fascinating about this is there's this moment in African American literary studies you talk about called the Black Arts Movement. And it's usually thought of another way people describe it, and it's the new Black poetry. But 2 of the most widely anthologized poets came out way before the 1970s. So it's kind of fascinating to start thinking about it when you do things by number. So that's why I'm kind of fascinated by how data makes you look at things in a little different way. And go when you get to the 1990s, it's Baraka, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Hughes, and McKay. So again, these older poets begin to show up a lot more during a more recent time than before. And then I'm gonna show you one more on this site, and I might change. So I should have just gone out of sight. The last one on the site I wanted to show you all was I just began collecting, and this kind of extends the point I was saying. I became fascinated with that idea. So when I noticed when I was tracking the data that Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and a few others who were pre-new Black poetry were showing up so much, it made me just say, let me collect all of the anthologies, or as many as I could from the era. And it made me kind of think. I mean, I still, of course, I have a book on the Black Arts Movement, but it did make me rethink, like, wow, we got to have different terms for just that moment, because so many of the anthologies of the era were not just on new material. So new Black poetry is kind of interesting. And even Black Arts Movement, since so much of the writing was not then. Anyway, you move through this in the same way, and you can see I started breaking these up by the different genres, and you can, on your own time, could just go through and hover over these. Poetry shows up more than anything, but it shows up because there are a lot of multi-genre books. And in any multi-genre book, it's always poetry. And one is just because it's easier to move poetry around. Now, as somebody who writes about poetry, I'm gonna tell you the hard thing about poetry is, the poets will charge you money though. So like I can quote Toni Morrison all day long, and I don't have to contact her estate or anything. But if I want to write my essay about Kathy Lou in 2 lines, she's gonna say, hey, anyway. She might not, but I can tell you some of the other poets, they really will. So it's fascinating, it's accessible, but then it's harder to write about. Anyway, so that's that. So I just wanted to show you all this. One thing that I thought was also interesting here is during the 1970s, or during this moment, 1965 to 1976, one of the things you see more than anything in the title is the term Black. And I think it sort of helps solidify this thing we call Black literature. because after that moment, Black doesn't show up as with much regularity. So it's kind of fascinating here. So if you do get a chance to go to this one, you can just go here and type any term you want. You can type Afro and just the ones that so Afro, Afro-American. You can type African. You can type American. And you see it shows up a lot more. But then, of course, when you say Black, shows more. And then some of these, you could, if it's a anthologist, Stephen Henderson was one of them. And so you'll see he's the anthology cover I showed you all early on. So that's one. I won't show today, but if you're interested and you have students, one of the things I've done on this site is made whiteboard animations. And so a whiteboard animation is, I'm trying to think of a good way to say, well, it's a video, but it also shows different kind of in illustrations, and you can put audio behind it. And I will find the Hughes one.
In June 1920, Langston Hughes, who had recently graduated from high school, was traveling by train to visit his father. At one point along his journey near St. Louis, Hughes crossed the Mississippi River, and the idea for a poem took shape. I've known rivers ancient as the world, and older than the flow of human blood in human veins.
All right, so I just want you all to see that, so to give you a sense of what a whiteboard animation is. So I've been making those for just about the poems I talk about, the most kind of anthologized poems, and it gives me a way, one, the big thing is it's a way to invite students into it in a much more visually stimulating way than sometimes I can talk in the classroom. But the other thing I wanted to show you all is how this data expands beyond poetry. So I've been working on another project with my younger brother. He's a professor of literature as well. And so we've been collecting a lot of data on African-American novels. And our thing is trying to figure out, okay, we have all these novels, but how do you make it accessible in ways? How do people gain access to it? Because in African-American literature, it's common, like if you teach a class, you might cover, I'm gonna throw a big number, 29, you won't cover 20 novels. You might cover 10 novels or so. But when you're collecting these bibliographies, like we have our novel collection up now to 1,200 novels. And so we're trying to say, like, hey, how do we make that kind of bibliography accessible to people beyond just showing people a list? So one thing we came up with is we worked with a designer to, like, we took 100 novelists and we said, okay, let's break them up by various things. So you start when you show up on this site, and then you can do it by generational cohort. And so the Lost Generation, 1883 to 1900, George Schuyler, Robert Fisher, George Schuyler, that is Gene Toomer. You can look at baby boomers, so people like Walter Mosley, Gloria Naylor, millennials, Kathleen Greenidge, Zakiya Harris, Jason Reynolds. And you could also look at birthplace region. Look how few folks show up from the West. You could look at the age at the time of their debut. So you see most people are in this area, 27 to 40, basically. Here's something else that's fascinating to me. I was looking at highest level formal education. This is Richard Wright. He went, junior high was as far as he went. Then you see what's happening these days. These have to be much younger folks, for the most part, but not all, but it's a lot more. Some high school, that's college children's. And then if you wanted to break it up by gender, you could. So you can see like that. So that was another kind of project of data that we were doing. So I just wanted to give you all a sense of that. And that, I'll have to get you all that site up here because it's all of these on what we call the literary data gathering. We have a lot of those where we're just playing around trying to see, like, what can you do with data to tell these different kinds of stories. The final one, I'll show you one more. We took a look at, there's a journal in our field called African American Review. And we wanted to look at the novelists who were most frequently mentioned in there. And no surprise, it was Toni Morrison. She shows a little more than everybody. And it's weird because again, it's like that Hughes thing, right? Like, you know that Zora Neale Hurston is one of the most written about novelists. You know that Richard Wright is. But Hurston, 50 articles have been written about her in African American Review. 56 have been written about Wright. That's, you know that big. But Morrison, 112. Like, it's just interesting to put these big numbers into scale like that. And then you can see during the 70s, actually, Wright was the most featured person. 80s, it was Wright and Morrison. And then later it just became Morrison. So this is another one you can just interact with the same way. In closing, I know it's common to talk about rivers when it comes to Langston Hughes, and I wanted to do that because it does make sense to talk about rivers since that's the same thing. But when I was thinking about technology, I said it's probably better to think about the route in which Hughes got there. So I think it's important to talk about bridges when we talk about the distance between African American literary studies and technology. I was thinking about how folks will say this phrase, they'll say, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But I started thinking we might have to say, we have to get to those new possibilities as we cross that bridge. That'll be something like Hughes came up with that point. Thank you all for listening. So questions, you said I need to move somewhere.
No, well, I
Oh.
was thinking, actually, I'm trying to see where the thing is. Yeah, maybe if you move over here, but the problem is that we need to make sure we're answering online questions as
Oh, okay.
well. But I can probably stand here. Do we have questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Okay.
This is fascinating, and this is absolutely something I will begin using in my class. But I have a question. I really like how you talked about both exposure and exclusion. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you make sure that a tool like this becomes a tool for Black students.
Oh, wow.
That it does. There's like a frequent thing that happens, and this has been written about a lot, is that the product, the African American literature becomes a kind of cultural capital for already privileged students, and that this kind of work would become, you could imagine, like in a well-funded university, that this could just become another kind of thing that gets used by people who already have access to this kind of thing. How do you make sure that this gets into that the right kinds of students get exposed to this kind of work? So
Hey, I was just
using the next generation.
It's funny, my little snide mark was like, God, thank goodness I'm at a not a well-funded university. But I hope is this recorded? Yeah. Anyway, they'll be irritated if they hear me say that. But God, it's not that's one thing I know, like, so doing it at a school like my school, which is not like, dang, I don't want to call any of the elite schools out, but we know them well. Yeah, it's amazing how many resources they have, and also just how non-diverse they are in some ways, in a lot of ways. So I think that's one of the things that just has to happen with technology and DHs, is it has to happen at schools like Southern Illinois University of Edwardsville. It has to happen at schools like Memphis State, okay, University of Memphis, right? You know, back in the day, that's only how we know it. Anyway, but yeah, I think we should be trying to do those projects because that's one way. And I think it's true though. Some cases it's just gonna get out of your hands. That's one of the things you read about technology, particularly like startups of social media like Twitter and which started in St. Louis, by the way. And Square, damn, I ain't doing an ad for St. Louis, but which also started in. Yeah, I know, right? That is. But what was fascinating about those things is they didn't expect them to go in the directions they did. So that's just one of the things with technology. It just always gets out of hand for people. Anyway, but I think that's one of the things, just like making sure to just have these projects going on in communities. And two, I think that's the other thing is, yeah, like having some space, like you work with a center institute, right? Having spaces where you're developing a project, and then just to know one of the burdens means you just have to keep developing new projects. Speaking of Square, I like to tell the story of Square, how it came about. Jack Dorsey, who was from St. Louis, and Jim McKelvey, the guy who founded, they co-created Square, but they only did it because Jack Dorsey got kicked out of Twitter at one point. And he wanted to stay in tech, and he came back home to St. Louis, he talked to Jim Gibbs, like, hey, we gotta come up with something. So they literally just sat around saying, damn, what can we do? They were just sitting around thinking of something to do. And the idea came about because Jim McKelvey had a hobby on the side of glass blowing, and somebody wanted to buy one of his creations, but didn't have the money with them at the time, and that's when the idea came. Anyway, but what I like about that story is just thinking about, if you are thinking in a tech way, then you have to just constantly say, hey, we just know that part of being in this world, and you have to just keep coming up with ideas. I mean, it's a burden sometimes, but I think that's what we have to think about, because yeah, you're right, like it's rare that so much of the biggest funded things in DH are just these elite institutions, and real people, I hate to say it like that, but real people aren't even around to see it. And I think that's even determines the outlook of the program. Like I literally started thinking of those whiteboard animations. I did this one on just a whim. I had my students look at a whiteboard animation that someone did with Jay-Z talking about the history of the war on drugs. And my students responded so positively to that. And I realized they were responding in part to the form. So I said, oh, wow, what if I put poetry content, something I like into this form they like? So anyway, I think that's part of what has to happen. Yes.
Natalia, I'm a resident over the philosophy department. And so thank you for your talk today. And I guess my question is, how are you, well, you make reference to it when you show the visuals, but how are you looking at reaching in terms of like what with the imagery that these poets use? Because with Hughes talking about the bridge, he's traveling along the Mississippi, it look a lot different than what Herschel was talking about.
Yeah.
So like, given it, well, I assume you probably had to give some consideration into that. But like, what more do you have to say about
Yeah, I hadn't given enough, because I think it's been cool for me with Hughes. That's one I feel strongly about, because when I'm talking to my students about it, I'm always saying, hey, he was at the bridge right near up, like the bridge many of us cross every day. And so that matters in a way. So yeah, I think it's good just to always find the spaces wherever you are and saying like, hey, let me build something up around this thing. And I've been fascinated with the bridges. So I would take groups of African-American students to Cincinnati, to a museum there. And to get to Cincinnati from where we are, you cross part of Kentucky and then go over that bridge and you're in Cincinnati. And the students don't listen to me for most of the time when I'm talking, but they listen when we get to that bridge and say, hey, pay a quick attention to this really quickly. I said, on this side of the bridge, we one thing. And then we are on the bridge and we're driving. I don't say anything. They're like, finish your statement. And then we get to the other side. And I say, on that side, we would have been slaves. On this side, we'd have been free. And it's just such a cool visual for them to see, like, the distance between freedom and slavery is not that big. Anyway, but it's a very location-specific thing that I think I probably couldn't get them to feel that if we were, I don't know, I can't name a random place, but like Idaho, not wouldn't be the same thing. So yeah, but I think it just comes naturally, and probably not naturally, just come over time, always thinking about locations and spaces and places. And also being scarred, going all the way back to Jackson, Tennessee, thinking about, I get very irritated when I think about, like, I'm in this little bitty city, like town, Jackson, and I can tell you all east side and north side. And in some major cities, all of that would be just one side of town. But yet it could be divides and certain things like that. So yeah, I think I'm probably just always thinking about the geography of works like that. I'm almost shaking my head now because I'm thinking about Toni Morrison and the Song of Solomon. And there's this character, he says that He said, like, all of us is about geography. And he's like, you'll say I'm a Southerner, but south of what? I'm a Northerner, but north of what, right? And so, yeah, just really thinking about those spaces. So I'm glad you said that, because it forced me to think about it more. I'm hoping that like everything I do is like trying to nod at like certain kind of spaces and places. And to do what Hughes did though, right? Like he's going across the Mississippi River, but he connects that to the Congo, and then he connects that to Euphrates and the Nile. I mean, out of high school, God, like what kind of, that was a serious education, which this is bad, you all, but because I almost wouldn't have done this if you didn't say this. But there's a twist in my story. I'm somehow they say during the story. And I remember I told you all there's a recording and Hughes says, like I'm fresh out of high school when I was 18, right? Here's the twist. In 2018, we discovered he wasn't 18, he was 19. He didn't know. So his whole life, he thought he was born in 1902. He was in fact born in 1901. And people didn't know that until 2018. And the reason that's important for this data story, because it means we got to rethink things. So when I found that out and the fact that he didn't know, I said, what kinds of things would you all change about your life if you discovered today that like, oh, I'm a year older, your mother had lied to you, and you discover you're a year older? Would it cause different things? Now, most people say, well, a year, that wouldn't matter much. Here's why I think it mattered with Hughes. When he left high school, one, he did really well in high school, but he was a year older than everyone. But when he left high school, he thought he was 18. And in 1919, W.E. Du Bois started this new publication called Brownies, and it was for African-American youth. And so before Hughes submitted his work to the Crisis, he submitted it to Brownies. They accepted it. And then they said, oh, do you have anything else? The editor said that, and the editor of Brownies happened to be also the editor of the Crisis. He slipped in, so he sent some useful poems, but he also sent an adult poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and that's how it became published. I don't think he would have submitted it if he had thought he was older. He could only do it because he thought he was younger. Anyway, so I think that kind of idea of how data causes us to shift just is really important, really kind of key.
It doesn't look like there's any questions online, so we have some more questions here, I think.
Okay. So I think the anthologies are really crucial as well. And I thought about this in grad school because you're smarter than me, which I love so much. Because it's about canonization, right? Canonization in the hands of Black editors.
Yeah.
That's really crucial, right? In terms of what we think about being a canon of African American literature inside of the university, right? But then with these poems, I really think about pedagogy and what poets are represented by. And a lot of with the Hughes poems, like a lot of those were not intended to be individual poems, right? But they're what he does a book-like poem. So I always talk about that. But the weirdest one for me is the Gwendolyn Brooks.
Oh yeah.
She is just known and represented by that one poem. It's like, is it Brooks? Is it,
I know.
when you go on to the Iliad, and it seems like such a disservice.
Yeah, now I know. I feel like poets get cursed by like that signature poem.
Right.
I mean, let's say blessing and curse. Because on the one hand, if you don't have a signature poem, nobody can really know you. But then if you have a signature poem, then like it's like, those like musicians, they'll go place and everybody want to hear this one, hey, but are they gonna do their hit? So yeah, it's tough. One of the things I've learned though about searching those out, like literature scholars, we say that, like, yeah, they did, and they did overpublish their poem. But I was surprised they didn't publish it as much as I thought they did. So they published a lot, but it just wasn't as much as I thought they did. But then for her, though, I think anthologies I don't think if she had gathered up the anthologies the way I did, I mean, thank God for her that she did though, because it's a very tedious work, but when you gather them up, you start seeing different kinds of things. And that's something I felt a little better for her. I was like, okay, she's out there a lot more. And maybe I'm comparing her to other people though, too. But she's showing up so much. But yeah, it was frustrating. I was thinking that with Hughes, though, the thing with his is sad, like he was like, as he thought he was 19 when that poem came out. You know, he was 20. But I would be like, dang, I would hate to be a poet and you get known by the work you do when you're 19 or 20 and you know, you live to be what's in his 60s. Like, dang, wow, that was like, I wonder about that pressure. And there's so many writers I think about that when they publish something and get known early on. Yeah, that seems to be, I mean, it might be a champagne problem, right? But still, it's still like I mean, I think as an artist, it could be very frustrating to be like, wow, I've tried to move on and, you know, but that's the one. Cause I'll be very embarrassed. I'm very embarrassed of things I wrote when I was 18 and 20 and 30 and 40 and probably last week, you know, so yeah, anyway, so it's fascinating to think about that.
You know what the second post anthology.
Oh, dad, I don't have it on. I'm gonna get, you know, I'm gonna send it to you because I have close to that. Yeah, but it's it's a drop off, but it was a little bit more than I thought. I'll get it to you. Yeah, no, it's exciting. You know, as a all of this stuff emerges out of bibliography work, by the way. And on some level, you know, bibliography is very, if you're not into bibliography, it's very boring, but I get excited tracing those out because you just learn so much. Oh yeah,
So,
sure.
And it's about kind of what you're talking about, but just another access and physical archives, because you're making these wonderful digital archives, book covers. And have you experienced in your bibliographic work a difficulty in accessing these Black anthologies that's different than, is it harder to find the Black anthologies than it is to find the 60s version of the Norton Anthology of American Poetry, which would have been an integrated author list?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh well, yeah, of course. Like I've been fortunate in the spaces I've been. So I went to grad school at Penn State and they just happened to have a really good collection in the library. And then when I went to SIU, my faculty mentor, he's since retired, he just had a really good library, Eugene Redmond. So I was able to just go through all of his materials and, you know, he like somebody who will publish 2 issues of something, like only 2 issues. They keep one, they publish 3, they keep one, they get one of their mother, and then somehow Redmond will get the other copy. And so he has all this stuff. But yeah, aside from that though, it's hard to get some of these things because they didn't have a big print run, just all kinds of challenges getting that. So yeah, just doing Black bibliography work is, depending on what you're trying to get, yeah, it can be a challenge sometimes. But I mean, yes, so and then to add on challenges, just doing the technology work though is really one thing that's kind of because in African American literature, the good news is I feel has become specialized over the years. That's also a challenge because you're expected to know a little bit more. And you, especially when you're a grad student, you spend your time, now you know, Natalia, you know that like being a grad student, you're like called on to know a lot. And so you really want to learn all of these things. So you don't have time to do the tech and digital projects. But then there's this whole world of funding for digital and tech projects. So when you get out, you know all of this stuff about African American literature, but then there are these tech things you don't know. So that, to me, that is just like, I don't know what to even do about it. It's a challenge I know I can specify, but it's just hard. And I would say when it comes down to funding, right? Now I'm in this room and I'm like, oh snap, University of Memphis is doing a whole lot, you know? But let's assume that you all do know something about some financial challenges, right? what if you're an African-American grad student and you have to make a decision? Do I go to the African-American Literature Conference? Or where there's a lot of African-Americans there? Or do I go to the technology conference? You know, where it's not as much in my subject matter, but I'm gonna learn a lot about technology. If you're at a school that has a lot of resources, you can go to both conferences. But if you're at my school, you go to one and get partial funding to go to that. So yeah, nah, that's a big challenge. I was real quick, I gotta take my shot at Harvard, but I was at a conference once on it was librarians, and somehow they made a mistake and invited me too. And I was at a table, they put us in small groups, and I was at an official at the library who was from Harvard. And it was weird because we were talking about challenges people face. And the people from Harvard in my group, and financial was not on the table at all. And in fact, I would never get to the official, a dean, she said, I've heard about some schools that have financial trouble. Like, it was this foreign thing. Like, I've heard that they can't go places. They can't, like, it was, and she wasn't even trying to be mean. That's why it felt so, and I was just like, wow, like we are all in the same country. And we were at the same table, but it was just like, anyway, but on African-American Lit, yeah, like, what do you do? And I think that's been happening for 20 something years, where you're sitting in a room, I'm sitting in a room with people in African-American Lit, and they have these really far out projects, but the digital part is very tough because you just don't get to build up your skills in that way.
Sorry, I just want to get the person online. Do you have?
That's what I was gonna say.
Oh, sorry.
It's actually linked. Mine is completely unrelated.
Oh, wow, yeah, how is my institution? Well, I can't say the institution is done. Another privilege I have here, so they acknowledge my own privilege. It's not like the Harvard privilege, but I do have the privilege, like some of these things I'm doing at this stage when I'm a full professor. And so it's things I don't have to worry about, you know, like, so I can do this project and I enjoy it. But if, you know, if it's, I can apply to grants, I've been applying to grants. I would love to get the grants I apply for, but if I don't get them, oh, well, you know, and if I don't publish on anything on this, hey, that's too bad, but it's not gonna, it doesn't feel like a waste of time. I don't think I could have done that as like, or starting off as a junior professor. So that's the thing. So I have to find ways to make my junior colleagues, how this has to count for them. That's really the thing I have to figure out in some way. Like if I have them contribute to some part, we have to make that count, which I now I can give my institution credit. They will, if I can make a case for a junior colleague, like hey, I'll talk to a junior colleague and I'll say, I was giving a presentation, I just mentioned We Real Cool, but another person in the audience asked about other poems by Gwendolyn Brooks. Can you produce bibliographies? We'll turn some data stories, we'll create whiteboard animation. And if they do that and it's on the site, we'll have that count towards some kind of something towards their tenure. That would be important. I'm glad I was pushed to think about that. So in that way, my institution is good in that way. But what's really been a help is me working with the DH Center, and just already had relationships with people in literature. And then when they hired a person who did like the kind of digital resources and the web work, that I was able to just fall in line and we were able to collaborate. That was the most important support I had, because I don't think I could have done that otherwise and on my own. Yeah, I know I can have. So I think that's been the most crucial thing, just having people willing to sit with you and actually talk through the ideas. And that's just something you just do not get enough of. So, and I'll say this, how they've institutionalized it, the DH Center in my school. So if you all are developing your DH Center, I think this will be important. If you have something like the people who are running a DH Center, and particularly the person who does the web projects, like they have a once a week, they call it their coffee with theirs is called the Iris Center. They have like coffee with Iris, and it's every Wednesday at 11. And they've been doing this for the last couple of years, and I'm there every time. And yeah, that's how this project came together. Because I would just sit there and talk through it. and say, what might it look like and what's possible and blah, blah, blah. And finally you start putting things together like that. So yeah, I think that's very crucial. So if it is people just, because if you haven't been into that, the talking through it is very crucial. So anyway.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering
yeah.
about, like, so the whiteboard, don't even ask me, that was so complicated, I think it's magic, right? Like, I have no concept how to put them, I've seen them, but
Yeah.
yeah, wow. But your visualizations are really simple and very clear, and so I was really impressed. You know, so many times with like visualizations or digital humanities projects, people start with these huge ideas that they've seen Google Maps and they want to make their own Google Maps. Yours was so clear and you really got to the point, you know, gender, generation,
Yeah.
cohorts, right? So that was exactly what I was wondering is how did you land on such simple, clear visualizations? Was that a lot of back and forth with the designer?
Nah, I think it was some of it had to do with my own simplicity, but yeah, I wish I could say something more. Yeah, no, it was that because it was just things I know in African American literature, like gender is so big. Like in some ways, I mean, to a fault in some ways. Like there are things we will overlook because we would like it went through a moment, I would say, between the 70s, 80s up to where it was like men, like you would say, black men, black women, black men, black women. So that was something in a way that just like I was always thinking about. So I knew whatever I designed, you just constantly thinking about men and women. And I sometimes say to a fault because we will overlook the Morrison thing, in particular Morrison. Like, it's not just that Morrison is more popular than many men. She's more popular than most women writers. And that's the part that people don't really talk about. So that's the only part when I say it's to a fault. And then generational.
These projects like use 98 colors because they have 98 types. You know,
Yeah, nah.
understand.
And this goes back to your question, and it connects to where you are and your students. Like so much of this, I know I'm going to have to talk to them about. And so they don't want to hear all of they were like, give us a few categories. So I had been working on that model.
Okay.
And so so that was what it was. Yeah. And you're right. I know, like, I don't want to, yeah, sometimes it's too much. And my head spins. I'll look at a project and there's just so much going on.
It seems like
Yeah.
there's that tension between wanting to like be the scholar and get into the weeds and like filter through all this amazing data, but that's also in tension with making this accessible to a wider audience.
Yeah.
You know, so if it's about educating, you know, people outside the academy or younger students and bringing them into there's like this
Yeah.
struggle. You can't do both.
Yeah,
Some
yeah.
tension between like the appeal of digital work and databases often is an appeal to comprehensiveness. You know, like, I will collect every single
Yeah, oh my God, yeah.
in a way that, you know, previous methodologies wouldn't do.
Mhm.
And then you have that tension with like the ease of the simplicity of visual attention.
Right.
It was double.
Yeah.
Yeah, nah, we sometimes are so almost, I'll use the term sophisticated in literary studies and other fields that you feel like you have to say everything. And so I started trying to balance that about like, what, you know, when people are talking to me, what do they really, you know what I mean? What do they want? So trying to simplify in that way. I wanted to go back real quick to the end of Sarah Potter's question. She said support for students wanting to get involved in this work. I would say one of the best things so there's this site called Fiverr, and they did my first whiteboard animations. And they were nice. They looked really good. But they also, I felt like, dang, they kind of overcharged. And so I had just a little bit of this grant money. I'm talking about like literally $300. And I was able to purchase I have a year subscription to something called Doodly, and they do whiteboard. You can get whiteboard animation. I don't even know how to do them. I have a grad student, and she's just like curious about technology. I said, do you know how to do whiteboard? She's like, nope. I said, are you interested in learning? She's like, sure. So I bought the subscription. Once a week, she does a new whiteboard animation. So I will give her, like I will literally record or have someone else record a statement. And then she will make the whiteboard animation. And we meet once a week. And she'll say, here's what, you know, here's a draft of it. I was going in this direction, what you thinking, I'll say something, then the next week you'll have it, and we're gonna do that for the next exactly a year, because that's when the subscription runs out. And so I think that's one way to answer your question, Sarah, about it, like getting students involved in it. And the other thing I do to get students involved, we had another small grant, and students can do audio productions. And so the person you heard speaking on this was a voice actor for Fiverr, but now I'm gonna have students where they will just, we'll write up things together in something very short. And then one of them will read it, and so just giving them different ways to get involved has been really cool and interesting. Especially tech, because students just like doing and building those kinds of things.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, make sure you have.
Yeah, I got
Yeah. Yeah. But,